Hi, I'm Ginny Burton. I was born Virginia Hermy in October of 1972. I was born in Tacoma, Washington. I think anytime a child is growing up, it's not often easy to see sort of outside of your circumstances. And I thought I was as normal as any other kid in the world. But in a very short period of time, I learned that that just wasn't the case. I remember at the age of 4, it was 1976 when our house was raided and my dad was thrown down on the stairs in front of me. I was standing at the top of the stairs and I watched a slew of men tackle him and take him away. Then that was the last time my dad was ever in one of our houses when I was a kid. He went to prison for a number of crimes that he had committed with a crime partner. A few short nights later, one of his crime partners came to our home, and I was in the kitchen with my mom getting a drink of water, and he came into the house. My mom let him in, and he held a gun to my head and threatened my mom not to tell on him because apparently my mom had told on my dad. And that was the beginning of a life that I had no idea was going to grow roots for me. Couple of short years later, I was introduced to drugs by my mom. She had already remarried at the time. She had 3 other children with another man. My dad, of course, was serving a prison sentence. My mom thought it was a good idea to introduce marijuana to me. She had already introduced it to 2 of my brothers, and everybody was planning to smoke this weekend because my stepdad was getting a cancer treatment in a different town. And so I knew that my dad went to prison because of drugs. And I really wasn't interested in doing them. As a matter of fact, I was pretty terrified. I knew that drugs were bad, yet I was being encouraged to do them. And so I made the decision to submit. It's kind of like if you can't beat them, join them kind of thing. And so I participated. And what I learned from that experience was that I was accepted and loved in a way that I hadn't been before, at least in that moment. And that felt really good to me. And I think that that started to create a pattern in my life at that moment. So by the time I was in the 5th grade, I was smoking weed regularly. I had introduced it to my best friend at the time. My mom never had a job. We grew up on welfare. And then by the time I was in the 6th grade, I would consider myself a drug addict at that point. By the end of 6th grade, I would say the summer in between 6th and 7th, I started using methamphetamine with my mom. I had already tried cocaine with an adult that was not in my family. And by the time I was 14 years old, I was a crack addict. I started smoking crack with a school friend's brother who was 26 years old. And when I smoked crack the first time, I felt like I had arrived to the answer to all of my problems. And the interesting thing about drugs and me is that I didn't like the way they made me feel until I tried crack cocaine. But with methamphetamine and marijuana, alcohol, I did not like the way that they made me feel, but I did have an experience with them that they helped me to escape the reality of my life. There was a tremendous amount of violence and abuse. My mom didn't like me or my siblings, but she was particularly fond of being violent toward me for a long period of time. Between 12 and 13 is when I realized that I was faster than her, and so I could run. And I started to run away from home. I tried to go live with my dad for a short period of time, but his wife wasn't very fond of me, and I wasn't really comfortable with another woman being aggressive toward me. I figured if I was going to allow that to happen, it was going to happen with my mom. My mom and I quickly grew into drug partners. I ended up incarcerated the first time. I believe it was between 12 and 13. And my mom had dropped me off at a juvenile facility. I broke into a high school portable with some friends. They actually did it. I just went in with them, and I ended up doing time in juvenile hall. So that's where my relationship with incarceration began. I I spent most of my junior high years in and out of juvenile facilities and using drugs pretty heavily. I had started to commit crimes with some of the friends that I hung around with. We would burglarize places, typically places that, that belonged to people that we knew, so we could pay for our very meager drug habits at that time. I was living from house to house. I had lived with my grandmother for a little while, but of course my behavior was pretty challenging, and I made the decision to take off so I could do whatever I wanted to do. I went and lived with my mom again for a short period of time after I was released from a juvenile facility. And it didn't take long until I met the cocaine dealers in the area, and my cocaine use spiraled out of control. I ended up leaving home. I left home at the age of 15 and started living with other people and babysitting their kids to pay my way. Um, I was a full-blown cocaine addict by the time I was 16. My mom's house ended up getting raided because she was growing weed in the basement, and she moved back to the town where we were originally from. We had moved around quite a bit, and so I was living in Longview, Washington for a while during that time. And at the age of 16, I started hitchhiking back and forth from Longview to Tacoma. And then I met this guy that was selling methamphetamine when I was 16, and my mom started buying drugs from him. A few months later, he sexually assaulted me, and somebody watched it happen. And probably, I want to say 3 to 4 weeks later, he came into a house that I was in. Two people had guns. They kidnapped me and handcuffed me to the steering wheel of a car. And about 5 to 7 people had me in a shooting range way out in this place called Harts Lake in Pierce County. It was in South Pierce County. And 2 of them beat on me. They beat me up. They had me handcuffed. They cut my hair off with a knife. They spray painted me black. Some of the other people were just watching while that happened. After they did that, they handcuffed me to the door handle. This is back in the day when, door handles protruded from the car, and they handcuffed me to a door handle while the car that I was handcuffed to drove, and I was barefooted, and so I was having to run alongside the car while another car drove at me. After they were finished, and this was about an 8-hour process, they put me in the car and they dropped me off at my mom's house. And my mom told her husband to get me out of the house, that's what I deserved. And that was probably one of the most devastating experiences of my life. It had a massive impact on me. I still have a hard time talking about that without getting emotional. So my mental health pretty much declined, and how I responded to that was I did more drugs and alcohol. I became afraid to sleep, and that's when I got my hands on my first handgun. My mom's husband at the time, it was her 5th husband. My mom's husband gave me a .22 pistol, and I carried that around with me, and I did everything in my power to not sleep because I didn't want somebody to be able to come in and ever do that to me again. About a month after that, the same people that kidnapped me caught my grandmother's house on fire, thinking that I was in there trying to kill me because I had turned them into the police. The police never prosecuted any of the 5 people that were directly responsible for the things that happened. I picked them all out of lineups. They took pictures of my body and the bruises, and they kept my clothes. I had cuts and bruises around my wrist from the handcuffs. My nose was broken. I had bruises on my face. My hair was cut off. There was spray paint everywhere. And so what I learned at that time was that the system doesn't help people like me. All the while I was still committing crimes, and I was still doing drugs, and I was still ending up in places like juvenile hall. A short period of time after they lit my grandma's house on fire, I attempted suicide. I was heavily intoxicated, and at that point I was a blackout drinker. So it was kind of crazy. I was using a lot of methamphetamine at the time. I wasn't sleeping, and then I would go places and I would binge drink liquor at parties, and then I would completely black out because I would be sleep deprived, and nutrient deprived because I wasn't eating right. And I ended up throwing myself in front of a car, and it turned out to be a cop car. And I was taken to a psych ward where my clothes were cut off and I had 5-point restraints, and they put me in the facility upstairs for a short period of time. And of course, I was 17 years old at the time. And then my mom came. I remember my mom came to the hospital. Mind you, my mom was my drug dealer for a long time, and so it was kind of humorous. She advocated with the people at the psych ward to put me into a treatment center, a drug treatment center. And I couldn't have been more blown away at that interaction with her and the hospital officials. So, because again, my mom was a methamphetamine dealer at the time. So I went to treatment, and I ended up getting kicked out after spending the day with my mom and her husband, and they were fighting all day. And I was accused of using. I did a UA, and I even let them take a blood test because the treatment center was inside of a hospital. And because I hadn't used, and I was pretty frustrated about being accused of something that I didn't do. But I did end up leaving that treatment center, and of course I spiraled out of control. I went back to my mom's house, and my drug use increased. I would say that my insanity increased at that time. I felt like I was caught in this vortex that I was probably never going to be able to get out of. When I was young, I thought that I would be an attorney. I thought I would go to college. And that was not what happened. It's sometimes hard to look at those parts of my life as an adult and consider what that child had to go through. And so it's still emotional for me sometimes. I spent a number of years following that period of time. I would say between 16 and 17, they were some of the hardest years that I experienced. And they caused a lot of, I don't know, I guess post-traumatic stress responses to the things that would follow in my life. I met my first husband at the age of 17. He was very similar to my mother. At the time, I don't think I was able to identify that we become attracted to things that are familiar. And so that turned out to be another extremely abusive relationship. Very early on in the relationship, he was physically abusive, but he was sort of the gateway for me to how I would fund my drug addiction from that point on. And my drug addiction associated with that abuse definitely spiraled even farther out of control. But what that opportunity did is it gave me, it gave me the starting point to know how to independently take care of myself and stay high. And that's just kind of what I did. I stayed high because the reality of my life and everything that did not result for me was just constantly blasting me in the face. There's 7 kids in my family. My younger siblings, which there are 4 siblings that are younger than I am, they got the opportunity to watch how my life unfolded. And I tried to use my personal experience to deter them from following down the same path. I've always been the kind of person that feels like, well, I can take it, but you shouldn't have to. And so, one of my siblings was successful in not having a relationship with drugs. And a lot of it had to do with that period of time and seeing what happened to me. And so I was pretty grateful for that. Anyhow, with my first husband, him and I started doing burglaries. I stole a car. I stole my very first car. And, we started doing rapid burglaries in the area. We were stealing everything from stereos to multiple guns out of homes, and we were selling them for drugs. We eventually stole the second car, and we traveled to Longview, the place where I spent a couple of years, or at least 1 year. I'm not exactly sure how long I was there. I was a kid, and time seems a lot longer when you're a kid than it actually is in reality. And so, but anyways, we had went down to Longview, and of course I knew a lot of cocaine dealers down there, and I'm particularly fond of cocaine above all other drugs. I mean, honestly, if I could figure out a way to use cocaine and still maintain the life that I live today, I probably would, but it's just not the reality for me. But we went down to Longview, and we ended up breaking into a business down there. It was a Foot Locker or a locker room. It was before they became a real big thing. They were pretty small. It was a pretty small franchise back then. And the motel that we were staying in was surrounded by the police by mid-evening, and I made sure to finish the cocaine that we had before we were arrested. But we did let the police in, and he ended up going to prison for a couple of years, and I went to juvenile hall for a period of time, and then I was released. So after juvenile hall, I think I was there for probably about 30 days. After juvenile hall, I was sent back to my grandmother's, and I was mostly living a pretty chill life for a few months, and of course I had to continue to party though, and that's what I called it back then. It was partying. It was still fun. I could go out and do stuff with my friends, but I had a hard time staying away from the narcotics, and so of course I started smoking crack cocaine again. Which for the most part, it was uneventful. No major crimes happening, no big violence. And then I met my son's father. So I met this guy on my 18th birthday. I met him in, I guess it would have been 1990. And him and I started seeing each other, not immediately around my birthday, but we ran into each other again the following January. And we were just kind of hanging out and having fun together. He was 21, I was 18. I ended up getting pregnant, and 5 months into my pregnancy, he was shot and killed. I had thought about terminating the pregnancy because I didn't really think I was capable of having a kid, but I made the decision to follow through with the pregnancy. My son was born in 1992. I planned to be a better mother than my mother. And what I didn't realize is that I didn't have a skill set to be a parent. For the most part, I was doing pretty good until that guy, my first husband, that of course I wasn't married to yet, but that I was with, that we were arrested in Longview. He ended up getting out of prison, and I got back together with him. So shortly after that, of course, the crime started, the drug use started. My grandmother took care of my son quite a bit. The abuse started not long after that. We were arrested in a motel room. I took the blame for the drugs that were in the motel room. He went back to prison for a short period of time. He got out, and then I got pregnant really quickly again. So I had another child January of 1993. She will be 30 years old in a couple of days. And, again, I didn't want to be pregnant with that child. I did not want to have his child. By the time I got pregnant, I already hated him. We had gotten married. I felt trapped. Didn't really know how to get out of that situation. It seemed that would be my entire life. That's just everything that I experienced my whole life. And, so when I got pregnant, I was pretty devastated. I was using a tremendous amount of cocaine and methamphetamine, but, I really tried to stick with the cocaine at that point. And I'm a pig when I use drugs. Like, I use an excessive amount of drugs, and we were committing an excessive amount of crimes. My mom taught me how to forge checks, and so I was successfully navigating stealing checks from businesses and depositing thousands of dollars into an account and spending all of that money on drugs. We lived in poverty and squalor, even though I was making that kind of money. My kids were neglected. They were definitely fed, but emotionally, they didn't have a present parent there. I ended up getting pregnant again shortly after. I was emaciated. I probably weighed less than 100 pounds. By the time I was 4 months pregnant, my ex-husband kicked me down a flight of stairs, and I had a subchorionic hemorrhage. There was a tear in my uterus after that. I ended up aborting that child, and our life spiraled out of control. More crimes, more drugs, more child neglect. It got to a point, the abuse was so bad and the drug use was so bad. We had gotten evicted, and we were living at his mom's house, and I had to escape. He held me hostage a lot of the time, and I ended up escaping from the apartment, and I called the detectives because anytime one of us was arrested, and typically I was arrested more often than not because I would have very emotionally reactive outbursts where I would become violent towards him. He was very abusive toward me, but I would lash out, and I would just kind of go crazy. And so during those times, he had me arrested on more than one occasion. I had called the police on him when he would beat me, and throughout my pregnancy with my daughter, I spent the majority of that time with bruises on my face and hidden in the house because I didn't want people to see me in public. And so, anyways, I believe I was probably around 21, maybe at this time, but I called the detectives and I told the detectives where I was. Anytime I was in jail, the detectives would come and they would tell me, I know that you're hiding things for him. And I would never participate with what they were asking. But this time I did. I called them and I just wanted out. I wanted freedom. I had some felony charges hanging over my head because of some of the stuff that him and I did, because I would deposit the checks into my account and in my name. And, and I would just do that. So I had some forgery charges hanging over my head, and I didn't really care. I just wanted to get away from him. And so he was taken to prison, and I believe he got a 6-year sentence. There were detectives that were asking me to testify against him for domestic violence related charges. They had multiple. There was the cop stood up on a chair and dropped this is back when printers came out with the paper that was connected to each other, and he dropped a sheet of paper that was taller than him that went all the way onto the floor and said, "This is how many times you have been either accused of being a perpetrator or a victim of domestic violence. We believe that if you don't do this, that he's going to get out and he's going to kill you." And I didn't participate. I figured he was going to prison, and that was fine. I ended up being sentenced to a treatment program for some of the charges that were hanging over my head. And I thought I was going to be able to start my life with my kids again. And, we had our own apartment. Things were going well. I went to treatment. I had a friend of mine watching my kids. And when I got out, the guy that she was seeing was a gang member and a drug dealer. And they were at my house. And I allowed something to trigger me, and I made the decision to use again. And so I was off to the races. My mom came and got my kids, and, my mom hadn't changed much from when she had raised me and being that drug addict. And, she ended up, doing some faulty stuff with my kids, and I allowed that to be the reason why I spiraled out of control. And that's when my IV drug use started. The years just kind of continued to go on that way. I had learned how to be a criminal from my first husband. And so, the state took my kids from me, and I tried to work with them to get them back, but I was a mess. I was an absolute mess. And I had started shooting drugs at that point, and you could tell, like, there was nothing about me that said those children should be returned to her care. And I hated myself because of it, but I couldn't stop using. And because of that, because of the self-hatred, because of the failure of being a parent, because I swore that I was going to be better than my mom, and then I failed at that too, just like I had failed by not using, I just allowed that self-hatred to grow in me and continue to compel me to do things that were really self-destructive. My life unfolded like that for a long time. I started going to prison. I went to prison the first time in 1996. I got out, and 7 months later, I went back to prison for another 5 years. In between those prison sentences, I was shot. I shot somebody else, and I was in a high-speed car chase, and ended up wrecking the car and breaking my arm. My life was insane. When I went to prison that second time, I knew without a doubt that I had a problem with drugs and it needed to change. I wanted to become somebody that I respected. And so I made a commitment to serve that sentence, to work on that, so that I could be a mom that I actually had respect for. And so that's what I did. I knew that it had to start with not using drugs. And so while I was in prison, I tried to do everything I could to try to heal and grow those parts of me that were extremely damaged. I got released from prison that time, and I stayed clean and sober. I met somebody that was a member of a 12-step recovery group when I was in there, and they suggested that I go to a meeting and that I introduce myself, and so that's what I did. I also left Tacoma and I moved to Seattle, and even though they're only 35 minutes apart, it was like being in a completely different world. People in Tacoma that I knew, we did drugs. Our parents did drugs. We robbed people. We were technically heathens and degenerates. And, I was engaging with this community of people in Seattle from the moment that I got there. And they just did different things. They were in recovery. They had conversations about things that didn't include drugs and crime. And so I just kept hanging out in these places, and I learned how to live a little bit differently. I was working really hard to try to gain custody back of my kids. My kids at that point were in a foster home. I really felt like I had let them down. And I was doing well. I was clean and sober for a period of time. My kids were coming and staying with me for about a year and a half. And then what happened is my grandmother got sick. I went out on a fishing boat working and came back. And while I was on the fishing boat, there was a tremendous amount of sexual harassment. And I made the decision when I had come back, I was going to help my grandma out. She was pretty sick. Turned out she had pancreatic cancer. And not long after that, she died. And that's when I made the excuse to use again. I signed my rights over to my kids, and my life again spiraled out of control. I entered into a relationship with heroin and cocaine. And the diseases of addiction took hold of my life in ways that it never had before. There was a huge difference, though. I was using in Seattle, and Seattle was a lot more lenient. They were a lot more willing, and when I say they, I think I mean the system. So it's a much bigger city than Tacoma, and I was able to use with impunity there for a period of time. I wasn't the most obvious person the way that I was when I was in Tacoma, and what that allowed me to do is that allowed me to go in and out of addiction for a period of years. And I did that. I was loaded for a couple of years, and, the more I looked at myself in the mirror and recognized the truth that I let my kids down again, the more drugs I needed to do because I couldn't stand myself. And over the years, that's kind of what happened. I had continually gained this self-hatred that was growing and growing because I kept doing these things that I learned how to do when I was young, but that I never wanted to do in the first place. So it felt like I was living in this contradiction for a long time, and I didn't know how to get out of it. And I felt like I was a pretty smart person. I was pretty aware. I was pretty able to navigate sort of any setting that I was in, but I couldn't shake the relationship with drugs, and I didn't understand it. And so what I do, I just immersed myself in that life. And, I had a couple of periods of recovery. I got arrested a couple of times, but I was quickly released, and no charges were filed until, I want to say, let me see, I stopped in 2005. I had been in a relationship. I got out of the relationship. I ended up getting a settlement for the the fishing boat sexual harassment that happened. I paid off a bunch of bills. The person that I was with at the time, I paid off a bunch of their bills, and then I had a little over $30,000 left, and I made the decision to go pay my drug dealer back that I had ripped off when I was using them the last time, and then it opened the floodgates for me again. I started seeing this guy that I used to sell drugs to, a couple years before that, and I got pregnant by him. I didn't know I was pregnant, but we were using together. We were really far gone. I probably weighed less than 90 pounds, and I'm 5'9", so I was pretty emaciated. And there are actually some pictures that have traveled all around the internet of me during that time. It was a 2005 booking photo in jail where I literally looked like I was the Walking Dead. And my standard statement back during that time was, it takes a lot of money to look like this, because people definitely commented on my appearance a lot. I couldn't walk into a store without store staff following me around thinking I was going to steal from them, which was the last thing I ever wanted to do, because I didn't want to draw attention to myself, because I was obviously a drug addict. I ended up getting pregnant again, though. I got clean, went to my mom's in Idaho, and had this baby. And I felt pretty guilty when I was pregnant, when I found out that I was pregnant, because I had abandoned my children that I cared very much for. And so, not really realizing that I was putting a huge burden on my older kids, I asked them, I said, how do you feel about me being pregnant? Because if you're not comfortable with it, I will have an abortion. And I'll be honest with you, I wasn't emotionally mature enough to know that was probably very damaging, to put that responsibility into the hands of two teenage kids. But that's what I did. And they very much wanted me to have her, and I did. I had the baby. She was healthy. I used through each of my pregnancies. I was mostly clean for the first 5 months of this pregnancy. It was a high risk pregnancy. I had 2 subchorionic hemorrhages, so 2 internal tears in my uterus. And I was on bed rest for a period of time, but I had a 9 pound, 5 ounce baby girl who definitely didn't seem like she was lacking in much of anything. But again, I used through the pregnancy, and, I definitely, didn't feel very good about myself about that. And so when she was born, I made the decision that I was going to stay clean. Made the decision that I wasn't going to do to her what I did to my older kids. And 18 months later, I got loaded again. And so it had a massive impact on this child. Her dad at the time was clean in a drug court program, and he sent my daughter to live with my sister, who, bless my sister's heart, but she wasn't much better of a parent than I was. And so stuff ended up happening there, and she came back, meaning that my sister abandoned my kid at her daycare place and went chasing this guy. And of course, throughout my children's lives, I would get angry that people were not raising my children the way I thought they should. I literally had zero awareness that the responsibility to raise them that way was mine. I just didn't know that. I would become indignant and argumentative and aggressive and threaten people because they were not parenting my children in the way that they needed to be parented. But I really didn't have any confidence in myself as a human being, let alone a parent to 3 beautiful kids. And I really believed that by allowing them to stay where they were, that I was benefiting their life much more than I would be if I actually had them in my care. So I stayed loaded. He took my kid. I had no reason to do anything else. And I spiraled out of control. And I, of course, was committing crimes. And this time I ended up homeless on the streets of Seattle. And, sometimes people look at somebody like myself and they definitely underestimate me. And I come from Tacoma, which is very different than Seattle. And so there were some men that tried to take advantage of me in a number of ways when I was in Seattle. And that just wasn't happening. So I gained a tremendous amount of street credibility in a lot of different areas that most people wouldn't, especially women. And I maintained my addiction for a period of time. I was stabbed in the chest, in the left-hand side of my chest in 2008. I assaulted this woman a number of times, and the third time I was going to beat her up in this place because she had taken something that didn't belong to her, and she had a really smart mouth. She stabbed me right in my chest, and I didn't realize I had been stabbed at the time until somebody pointed out that I had blood all over me. So I made my way to Harborview Hospital, and they kept me in there for a couple of days to make sure that my lung hadn't been punctured or anything like that. And so I got out of the hospital, and of course that didn't stop. And I also ended up with an infection in this finger. I don't know if you can see the difference between my fingers, but my drug use prohibited me from going and having the infection taken care of, and the infection went in and got into my bone. And that still wasn't enough for me to stop, but I was arrested eventually in 2008 and taken to jail, and I was facing another prison sentence. And I stayed out in the community in a program called CCAP for a period of time, and I was able to gain my footing a bit before I went to prison. And I was sentenced to 33 months in the Washington Correction Center for Women, and I went back to prison in 2009. I had gotten credit for the period of time that I was out. They believed I had done exceptionally well. I did have one relapse during that time that the system was not aware of, but I did go into prison clean and sober. I got out of prison. I was staying clean. I ended up with 2 years clean. So I think I got at least 6 months clean after prison. I was set up with a place to live and a job before I had gotten out, and I was doing well. And then this person entered into my life from my past. He had come up to me at a meeting, and he said, "Is your name Ginny Bromley?" And because that was the name I went by for a long time. My mom's second husband's name was Bromley, and she changed all of our names, my brothers and sisters and I. And the moment that he said that, I knew exactly who it was, and I thought I was going to faint, honestly. So the guy his name was Johnny King. He was the person that shot and killed my son's dad in 1991. And I had testified at this person's sentencing, asking that the judge give them the maximum amount of time possible because, and I had my infant son with me at the time, and I asked them to really give them a lengthy sentence because my son would be without a father for the rest of his life. So I really didn't know what was going to happen when I saw this guy, but he wanted to make amends to me, and there was this really strange thing that occurred. I'm a very forgiving and open person, and I gave him the opportunity to make that amends to me. And then there was this connection. There was this spark, this electricity, and it was uncomfortable and it was interesting. And I ended up in a relationship with him not long after that. And it turned out just as bad as it sounds, honestly. But it was also the catalyst for where I'm at today. And where I'm at today is, I ended up in a relationship with that guy. My mom ended up passing away from drug-related health problems in 2011. So I was released from prison in 2010, met him, went into a relationship with him. I married him in 2011. And then my mom died in November of 2011. Of course, domestic violence entered into the relationship very quickly, and I made the decision to pick up again, even though I really didn't want to. And with this specific relapse, it was really unique and interesting because I chose to pick up when I didn't want to. I was just really paying really close attention to what was occurring. And what happened is once I picked up, this huge beast just woke up inside of me. And I started to feel obsessed. And I had the compulsion to use. It was like all of the tissue in my body woke up and was like, yes, this is what you need. And then I just couldn't stop once I started. And I wanted to with everything in me. And I maintained the relationship that was extremely violent. And we went through all kinds of crazy things during that time. So I used pretty intensely. I started again committing crimes, and what that looks like is like I victimize people in society when I commit crimes. I break into their houses, I break into their cars, I steal their mail, I rob their bank accounts, I will take their belongings and rifle through them, and I violently violate people. I cannot tell you how many times I've actually assaulted people. It's been a lot, and all of those things were taking place, but like I had this conscious mind that was saying, what are you doing? And no matter how much that conscious mind was present saying you need to stop, my physical body could not break away from the drugs. And so I was existing to run from him, to commit crimes, to pay for drugs, to stay awake and run from him. And I prayed for death. He had come into an apartment after me with a hammer toward the end of my using, and I had this backpack, and in the backpack I had multiple psychotropic pills, hundreds of them, and I used them when I could to intoxicate people that I was around, typically very innocent victims that were not addicts, so I could rob them. And instead of, doing anything and just, submissively leaving with him, I swallowed all of the pills that I could before he was able to get his hands on me. And he drove around with me long enough for them to become somewhat absorbed in my system, and then he forced me to throw up. I blacked out after that, and 4 days later, I woke up in an apartment with a friend of mine. Apparently, he transferred cars. He threatened my friend. He threatened all of my friends. He had broke into my friends' house with baseball bats and threatened them at gunpoint and all kinds of things. So it was just a succession of the insanity that I had experienced my entire life. Mind you, I was 39 years old at this time. I think I might have even already turned 40. And I was constantly asking myself, like, what are you doing? I was getting old. I'm definitely aging. And, how was I going to maintain this lifestyle? Like, what was it going to look like for me? I was homeless. I didn't have money. I am not the kind of drug addict that somebody's going to hire, because the moment I start using, it becomes very obvious that I'm under the influence. And within weeks, I'm extremely emaciated, and I look like somebody that's going to rob you. And everything I do is always me. I'm scouting out the next victim. I'm scouting out the next opportunity so I can stay high. And it's very obvious, I think, to people in society, because people tend to stay away from me. And I tend to exist at night because that's when it's safe for me to be out. However, I woke up. I couldn't formulate words. I had thoughts in my mind. I was strung out on heroin at the time, and I had been in this state for a number of days, and I could feel that I was dope sick. I couldn't communicate what I needed. But eventually all of that wore off, and and about, I think, I want to say 2 months later, I was arrested, and that was in December of 2012. Then that is when my life changed. A couple days before that, I remember I was walking, it was about 3:00 in the morning, and, there's this, it's a native belief, I believe, that when you see an owl, when it flies across your path, or when you see an owl, that it represents death. It's somebody's going to die. And the interesting thing, so I was walking across this overpass in Tacoma, and I just remember I was praying. I was praying for death. I was asking that, if there was a God, please just let me go. Like, living 40 years. And of course, there were a few years that weren't completely traumatic. I'd spent a little bit of prison time. I had been clean and sober a couple years here and there. And so they weren't all extremely traumatic. I had had a small taste of what life potentially could be like. But, as those common experiences continued to enter my life, I believed that was my lot, and that there's no way there could have been a God, because I really didn't deserve the things that had occurred from the beginning. And so, of course, and it's always so interesting that anybody that says they don't believe there's a God, you're always talking to God when you're in these like like deep places of misery and despair. And that's what I was doing. I was like, if there is something, just please, just let me die. Just kill me. And no sooner did I say that than I literally saw an owl fly across my path. And then a couple days later, I was literally arrested. And I didn't really recognize the significance of that experience. But I did know that the moment that I was put into a police car, that it was over. And I felt a tremendous amount of relief. I knew that I wasn't going to be released because I owed a bondsman, and the bondsmen were running around looking for me at the time. And I'm really good at eluding that kind of stuff. So, but I wasn't good at financially maintaining my existence, which probably would have helped carry me a little bit longer. But, thankfully, I just didn't have the energy to continue on in the way that I had been continuing on in. And so when I was arrested, and I was put into handcuffs, there was a thing that commonly occurs for me, and I fall asleep in the back of the cop car, and that's exactly what happened. The cop was pretty nice. He was pretty gentle. He wasn't berating me. I've definitely had experiences where that has happened, but that wasn't the case this time. And it didn't matter anyway. I just knew I was tired. I was done. And there was this other thing happening in me, right? Like that was I want to say my spiritual mind, my real internals, but there was this surface thing that was going on, and it was my addict. It was my addiction. And my addiction did not want to be arrested. My addiction wanted to continue to use. But it was time for me to be done. And what I didn't realize at the time is that I was experiencing a death. I was experiencing a death to that life. I have not picked up a drug or alcohol since that day. So my clean date is 12/6/12, so December 6th of 2012, because I did have drugs on me and I used them at the jail. So the next day I woke up and I haven't put a substance in my body, not a narcotic. I've definitely used ibuprofen and things like that. But and my life is different than I could have ever expected it to be. And, I didn't care where this transformation began. I didn't care if it was prison. I didn't care if it was jail. I didn't care if it was a homeless shelter. I just didn't care. I had literally nothing left. When I saw myself in the mirror, I was disgusted and realized how much I hated myself. My self-hatred even grew even more during that last relapse because, I held on to some things. I believed that I was a pretty good friend. I believed that I was honest and trustworthy, even though I let my kids down, even though I was a drug addict, even though I was victimizing people in the community. But to my close inner circle, there were these things: loyalty, honesty, respect, and and I had even lost touch with those things. I was stealing from some of my friends and, just different things where I just really did not respect the woman that was looking back at me in the mirror when I was in that holding cell. And that's when I knew that I had to be very intentional in how I approached this change. I had to dismantle the things that had been created and solidified in my life for 4 decades. And if I was going to be able to become somebody other than everything I'd always been, I was going to have to be willing to dismantle all of the things that I had been utilizing for my entire life and rebuild with something that I didn't know or understand. And so that's what I did, and it began in a carceral setting. So I used jail. It was an intervention, right? I had multiple interventions in my life up to this point. In my opinion, the interventions were ineffective. They did provide a respite. They provided a timeout where I was actually able to gain clarity of mind. And I want to say, everybody I've ever been incarcerated with, and I've been incarcerated with a lot of different people, even people in treatment, when you have that separation from the destructive path, you have an opportunity. And I see every single person take that opportunity to really contemplate what they're doing, the things that led them up to this place, and what they want to have be different when they're released, and even short jail stays. But one of the things that happens is, our fleshly, our surface-based desires to blot out the experiences and whatever that looks like for any individual, right? Whether it's like violence, abuse, like things that we've let ourselves down or let other people down on, all of those kind of things. Like those kind of things are really hard to face when an individual has a whole entire U-Haul truck full of them. And I honestly think that some of that, facing who we are, facing what we've done, doing that without any kind of adulterant, those are some of the things that compel us to return back to those very uncomfortable yet familiar environments. And so, and I recognize that. I recognize that the entire time I was using it, I knew that's not what I wanted to do. And it's a very interesting thing to have happen, to use drugs even though you don't want to, but you feel compelled to do it. It's very interesting. And it's very painful. At least it was for me. It was a very painful existence. Because every single time I put something in my body, I knew exactly what I was denying. All of the things that I was trying to deal with by using the drugs, those things were still there also. And then the continued problems, like letting my kids down again, like that was piled on top, along with the destruction and devastation that came with my current state of relapse in existence. And so, that's the truth for anybody that uses. But so I had compiled, a whole bunch of different things, and so, it was pretty intimidating for me. It's like, oh my gosh, how am I actually going to address all of those things? And, and what I did is I realized that all I needed to do in the moment was examine my own thinking. And as I looked at myself in the mirror and I looked at myself with disgust and I started to recognize the messages that were going on in my mind about me, I said, oh, that's where I have to start. Because I had just been in this abusive relationship and it was very synonymous with the relationship with my mom. And, he would say all kinds of nasty things. And I'm certain that I said nasty things to him as well. But, it was really powerful for me to recognize like, oh, wait a minute. Some of those things that he was saying, they're not actually true. And I had real life examples, even in my current state of addiction when I was on the streets, that counteracted the things that he said. But what I realized that was more important than that was that the things that he said, I made the decision to then follow up with messages that he was sharing with me that I was repeating to myself. So I was making outside messages my truth. And then I had to realize, like, have I always felt this way about myself? And the answer to that question was no. And so I got the opportunity at that point to really follow those thoughts back and those experiences back and recognize when I probably started saying those things to myself. And so, I've gotten to this place, and it started back then in 2012, where I recognize that I tend to complicate things. I adopt on these words to make them my truths, like, oh, I'm confused, I'm overwhelmed, when in reality, that was never the case at all. But I did use those things to give myself excuses to participate in behaviors that didn't really serve my highest self. And so I made it my mission while I was incarcerated in jail, facing that 4th prison sentence with 5 more felony charges, to change the way that I looked at myself. And that started with changing the message. I'm going to fast forward to 10 years later, which is right now. So I just recently had 10 years clean and sober. And I can tell you that the process that I began while I was in jail was monumental. It absolutely transformed my life. I stand here, well, I'm actually sitting here. So I sit here today, a person very different than anything I ever thought I was capable of. But the beautiful thing is that all of those things, and I think it's very beautiful today, that whole story that I talked about with my life, it was so necessary for me to get to where I am. And it created such a tapestry, inside of me that allows me really to be able to serve others that come from very similar places. And, and I just want to identify the places: poverty, addiction, eviction, abuse, violence, child welfare engagement, sexual assault, domestic violence, emotional abuse, being a perpetrator and a victim. And I could name a host of other things, but I think those things are really, really important to identify. And whenever somebody has had an experience in any of those areas or multiple experiences, I have an awareness of what it's like to be there. And I've taken everything that I've learned over my now 50 years of life, and I've turned that into drive to try to help change things for people that are experiencing or have experienced those things. The last 10 years haven't been easy. I started out in a homeless shelter. I was released to a homeless shelter. I ended up not going to prison a fourth time. I got an opportunity to do a drug court program in Seattle. I was involved in a nonprofit organization prior to going to prison, prior to relapsing. And that program helped me to retain a private attorney. That private attorney helped advocate to get me into a drug court program. And that's what happened. And so I made a commitment to follow through, even if I didn't like what was happening. I made a commitment to follow the appropriate chain of command and proper protocol, to not try to take shortcuts, to not try to use victim cards. And what I mean by that is like trying to make excuses of why it shouldn't be required of me to do certain things because I'm this happened to me because I've done this, so you should look at me differently. I made the decision to just be a participant. And sometimes that was really hard because I definitely did have supports on the back end with this nonprofit that I could have probably played some cards. But I made the decision to follow the proper chain of command. And as a matter of fact, I even got sanctioned twice. They accused me of using. I had 2 dilute UAs, and I was so pissed off about it that I went and got hair follicle tests and proved that I had been clean, the entire time. But I took the consequences and I followed through on those, even though I wanted to quit on a lot of days, even though I felt like they were doing these unfair things to me. I got kicked out of my clean and sober housing that they placed me in because a person that was on crack broke in and was trying to break into my neighbor's apartment, and I put her in a headlock and tossed her out the front door. And so the housing provider kicked me out because I assaulted another person by literally physically ejecting them, even though the drug court staff commended me, including the judge, because I was, caring for my neighbors, because this person didn't live in the building. That felt like a super huge blow, but what I did is I got very constructive, and I started looking for places that I was eligible to live, because of course I have 17 felony convictions, and so not always easy to get a place to live with that many convictions before some of the ordinances in Seattle changed. But I took things as they came. I made a commitment to be honest. When I made that commitment, and that, let me just say where that commitment started from. So when I made the decision to change the message, what this looked like for me is I started to make lists of the things that I was actually saying to myself. And I simplified the process on how to change that by writing the opposite on the other side of the page. Really simple. And I started to read these lists of things that I didn't believe about myself out loud to myself in the mirror in front of tons of other women in jail. And sometimes it felt ridiculous. But what happened for me is I started to look at myself in a different light. And when things that weren't really, truly weren't true started to surface, like if I said, "You're honest," and I knew that I had just told a white lie, what that did for me is it allowed me the opportunity and space to say, you know what? That wasn't true. What actually happened was this. And so I sort of convinced myself, I changed the wiring in my brain over a period of time. And I taught myself how to show up as a person that I respect. And I had to define what that looked like. What is respect? And I got the opportunity to consider people, outside of me that were involved in my life in one way or another that I actually did have respect for. And I thought about their qualities. And And that's when I decided what I wanted my qualities to be like. And I was able to draw on some of the assets that I had. I recognized that, I very diligently maintained an addiction for a long period of time. Like, your average person that doesn't want to be motivated to do anything or actually take action in anything, they normally don't stick with things that long. And so I said, well, I must have some pretty solid qualities that help me to be creative in how I got my needs met. And so I started to design this process for myself, and how I could turn things around by using the same skill set that I already had. And so that's what I've done. And in 2016, I was working for a behavioral health program after I graduated the drug court, which it took me 18 months, but I did it. And I could have done it, before that if they would have allowed me to not be sanctioned after I proved that I was clean and sober. But you know what? I just rolled with it. I stuck with it. I graduated. And then as soon as I graduated, I applied to work in social services with the largest nonprofit in Western Washington. And, and I did very well. I started out in a housing first program. Some of the women that were living in this program were women I'd been to prison with. Most of these people were on drugs. I would say 99% of the people that were in that building were on drugs. They were living their life very similarly to how they did on the streets. It was an eye-opening experience for me. At first, I didn't know if it would trigger me to be around people that were actively using drugs inside of a facility. And, it actually had a very opposite effect on me. I got the opportunity to see, especially with the women that I knew that I had done prison time with, and seeing how deteriorated they were. It gave me an opportunity to say, but for the grace of God go I. Like, that could very easily be me. But there was always also this other side for me where I was like, gosh, well, nobody ever offered me housing when I was on the streets. And, to be quite honest with you, today, I'm grateful that that didn't happen. I'm grateful that I was stuck out on the streets homeless toward the end of my addiction. I'm grateful that arrest was an option for me, because that opportunity, and during my last incarceration, I spent more than 6 months in a county jail, and I was able to participate in a treatment program while in there. So I was able to have some clarity of mind when I ended up in the homeless shelter, and then eventually transition into clean and sober housing, and then eventually, get my own housing, which I lived in my own housing. Longest I had ever lived in a place my entire life. I was there for 7 years prior to moving away from Seattle. In 2016, I was still working for that agency. I was working for a behavioral health program, and I was a peer counselor. During this time, the person that I was in a relationship with relapsed on drugs. They broke into the house and they beat me severely. I did call 911 before the assault completely occurred, and the entire thing was caught on 911 audio recording. I did prosecute him. I was pretty devastated. We had a great relationship until he, which is not something I'm completely familiar with, because I bring a whole lot of baggage with me. In my circumstances, I have never really had a healthy relationship. Everything's always been surrounded in violence and abuse and drug use and crime. And so I was kind of like a wild animal when I got together with this guy. But, in time, we were adjusting and things were going well, and then he relapsed. And my young child was actually living back with me at the time. Her dad relapsed on drugs. I was stable. She was living with me, and we were living in West Seattle. And, she was staying the night at a friend's house at the time, but he broke in and he assaulted me and it was all caught on tape, and I couldn't get off the ground. And I didn't know if that was going to be the experience that sort of tipped the scales with me and sent me into this sort of consistent place of traumatic response to everything around me. And so thankfully I had been practicing a process, and it was called RAP. So I had been being trained to be a facilitator for a wellness recovery action plan, and they helped me to map out this process. And the whole idea behind a rap is that you create a plan when you're well for when you're not well. And I had literally just created this plan. And so, so he's incarcerated. I'm covered in bruises. I can't work. I was about to be promoted into a position where I'm serving thousands of men in homelessness. And that was the intimidating part for me, is it's like, can I actually go serve these men that are like this guy that just did these things to me? And I was mad at God too. Another moment where I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Seriously, like this guy, and he was great. And now we're here. And, so I didn't really understand the meaning behind all of it. But what happened for me, through that process and through having him prosecuted and then finding out that he was looking at a life sentence, and I thought that was extreme. And I knew I needed to advocate for his help, or to help him, advocate, for his benefit, for him to get the help that he needed while he was incarcerated. Because I know that he was going to go into prison and come out the same person without intervention. A life sentence is ridiculous. And so I testified for him, and I also testified against him. I successfully helped him to navigate that situation through 2 different trials, which was absolutely grueling, because the trials usually consisted of me being on the stand for 2 days, battling with the prosecutor, and then having to go over that and listen to the 911 tape in front of people. And so it was kind of hard, and I was serving this huge population of men at the same time in these 3 different programs, and supervising 5 staff, and we were getting homeless folks into housing. And it was at the same time, I'm like working with these people. These people are asking me for more help than I can give them. I'm doing as much as I can, but I'm bound to the resources that are available, and all of the resources. And these people that I'm serving in this setting are just the same as me. They're the same as me. Turns out that I wasn't so traumatically impacted that it disabled me from being able to work in that field. But, after a period of time, I did recognize that I was not serving any of these people at my highest capacity. And so that converged with the same, period of time as the trial, where I'm like, this dude needs help. We have a broken system. Because I had a conversation with the advocate that was working with the prosecution, who said to me, and I quote, well, we believe that if we give people astronomically long sentences, that they learn how to do things differently. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. I was floored when I heard that. I was like, you got to be kidding me. Because there aren't services inside of prison. The services that are inside of jails and prison only reach about 5% of the population, in my experience, especially when they're left up to consent. We don't have a system that is set up for success, that is intentional. And so it was in that moment, I'm sitting in a meeting actually with a number of county officials and service providers from all over the city of Seattle. And I looked around, and I was considering the trial that I was participating in. And I asked myself, Ginny, is this it? Is this where you plan to retire? And I looked around, and these people with master's degrees they're competing by sharing people's vulnerabilities in a way to help them get, into housing. But the housing is the same thing as the streets, because they're just jam-packing everybody in there. And we're allowing drug use, and we're allowing victimization. And we have people inside of these places that don't know how to engage with people from this kind of lifestyle, let alone serve them in a way that benefits them. And the answer that I gave to myself was, no, this isn't it. And that's when I knew it was time. That the system needed to change, and that I apparently was supposed to be somebody that was participating in that process. That's when I made the decision to go back to school. I was full-time single momming middle schooler who was experiencing bullying on campus. And some of the times, I don't always talk about all of the components of my life, but I think it's pretty significant with this. I was literally going through trials, as the person that was testifying, I was the main witness. I was working for this agency. I was, supervising 3 programs. I was supervising 5 staff. I was carrying caseloads. We were housing a lot of people based on the program that I created. And, and because I was like, no, this isn't it, I made the decision to go to community college. I was constantly on my daughter's campus because she was experiencing all this crazy stuff. But I was visiting my husband. I stayed with the guy, by the way. And we are married. But I'll get to that. But I was visiting him. I was visiting my son who was in prison, serving a 10-year sentence across the state. And I was also mentoring folks that were getting out of prison. So I had a lot going on. And, but I was also learning to climb mountains, which was my self-care. But, I just really believed that we needed to experience a change in our entire social safety net, but beginning with the prison system. The majority of clients that I was serving when I was in social services were former prisoners. Again, this guy who today is my husband was a good decision, not like the last one that I talked about, but I really believed that he had the capability of doing a whole lot more. He lacked awareness in a lot of areas, specifically around his addiction and how his addiction connected to his problem with domestic violence. And I just really believed that with intervention, he would be able to do something different. And if we actually had the opportunity to have those kind of interventions inside of carceral settings, that we would be very intentionally serving that population in a much more effective way. And I was gaining a lot of insight by working for the social service agency, especially in a number of different capacities that I worked for them in. And then we have my own personal lived experience, which is what made me such an effective service provider, because I understood what was actually needed. And that's one of the things that made it really hard for me to think about moving into executive leadership with this nonprofit, because I would be essentially fundamentally opposing the narratives that were being pushed at the time and that are still being pushed today. And, not that I didn't work with a bunch of amazing people, and not that the clients that I served weren't also amazing people, but we were not effectively serving them in that setting. And so, very quickly, I started to excel in school. I was making it on the dean's list. I was becoming eligible for scholarships. I joined Phi Theta Kappa, an honor society. I applied for one of the largest transfer scholarships in the nation, which was the Jack Kent Cook, and I was a semifinalist, and apparently that was a big deal. I was being recruited by Ivy League colleges. I only chose to apply to one, which was Yale, but that was dependent on the scholarship. So when I didn't get the scholarship, I didn't make it into Yale, which is fine, because I didn't want to move to Connecticut. The schools weren't great there. I was already having experiences with my daughter's school, and it was really important to me that she was in a good school. And so, because I grew up in areas where the schools were not good, and I just didn't want her to have to battle those same kind of things. And so I really just wanted to stay in Seattle and go to the University of Washington. I knew that they were doing some really important things on the prison campuses that were nearby. And so, I wanted to attend the local university, and it also has very high standing. I believe that University of Washington is like the number 10 public university in the nation. And so, so I did. I got the Martin Honors Scholarship, which paid for my entire tuition at UW, and I went to study political science and law, society, and justice. During that time, at a Martin Honors event, actually, I learned about a scholarship that would fund part of my master's degree if I chose to apply to grad school, and that was the Truman Scholarship application that was being presented. I didn't know what a Truman Scholar was. I just was looking at $30,000 for grad school, and so I made the decision to apply. And it took a couple months, actually, to go through the application process. First, you have to be nominated. So you have to fill out a pre-application, And then that goes to the Office of Merit Scholarships at the University of Washington. So I filled out, I almost didn't because I just know that those scholarship applications can be so grueling. But I was encouraged by some of the staff to actually apply. So I did. And I was nominated. I was one of the nominees. Nobody at Seattle, the University of Washington Seattle campus had been selected as a Truman Scholar since 2011. I did not have a lot of confidence, honestly. I was getting really tired of the process. I was working with a scholarship advisor, and we would go over my stuff constantly. She was not doing any of the edits. She was just giving me feedback. So I was writing, I was answering these questions. And I filled out this massive application that included a policy proposal. And finally, the day before, the application deadline, we turned it in. And at that point, I was sure it wasn't good enough. And I was just happy to be done writing. But the process definitely helped me to become a better writer in some of my poli-sci classes, so that was great. And just a few short weeks later, I learned that I had made it as a finalist. This was huge. It was very exciting, but I still didn't really understand the depth of what I had applied for. I was just trying to get a little bit of funding for graduate school. So D-Day comes. COVID happened right before my my interview. And so these were in-person interviews. Truman holds in-person interviews, or at least they used to. I believe I was one of the last cohorts to go through an in-person interview, and it was pretty intimidating. I learned that I had an ulcer about 2 weeks before that. I was in massive pain, and so I was concerned that I was going to end up an emotional mess while going through this process. But, lo and behold, I didn't. We had a number of people that were at the place where we were going to interview, and we spent the entire day together. One person after another would go in and speak to the panel, and it was a panel. And they would throw out scenarios, and you would have to respond in regards to your policy proposal or just random questions that they asked. I was sitting in a room with a bunch of brilliant young people, and I was thinking, I was 48 years old at the time, and I was thinking to myself, why would they ever choose me? I'm old. Like, I don't have a lot to offer, the political or public service space. But these young people are going to have decades where they can successfully help to solve some of our nation's and local problems. And so I interviewed well, apparently. It was a pretty comfortable interview for me. They did ask a couple of questions that I think were supposed to be hard, but, I've been around the world for a little while, so I'm probably a little more easygoing than some of the young people. And I just figured, it is what it is. I honestly did not think I would be the one to get it. And then a short period of time later, before it was actually announced publicly, the president of the University of Washington, Anamari Kalse, called me directly at 7:30 in the morning to let me know that I was the Washington State Truman Scholar for 2020. I get a little emotional about that because it was when I won that scholarship that I realized that everything that I believed about myself, I was wrong. I understood a little bit more about what I was competing for, and they valued me. There were more than 650 applicants for that scholarship. There was one person chosen for every state. On occasion, there are a couple, but, out of all of the people that applied in the state of Washington, I was the one that got it. They viewed me as a pillar and a solid scholar to represent this very prestigious national public service community. When I learned all of those things at Leadership Week after, receiving the scholarship, I at first felt like a fraud. I was like, oh, I don't think they know who they've chosen, in which I was told we know exactly who we chose. And so it was a really beautiful experience. And it is the experience that propelled me into this place that I'm in today. It's because of adversity and trauma and challenge that I am who I am today. Those are the things that have compelled me to do the work that I am doing in my life today. With that Truman Scholarship, my policy proposal focused on creating a program to implement in carceral settings so that we can change our entire carceral environment, and then also have our social service and homeless industrial structures also mimic that same process. The process focuses on helping people to identify their own challenges, their own underlying causes, and then bring in the necessary supports to help them to transcend beyond their deficits. It would start with an in-depth assessment, and then a curriculum that helps an individual to identify their hang-ups. And then having community supports, because it takes a village. It doesn't just take a village to raise a child. It takes a village to heal a human being. And because I didn't have that village when I was young, I had to piecemeal that village together for myself as a 40-year-old woman all the way into the age of 50, because I still ask for help today. But that process that I put down in my policy proposal in the Truman Scholarship is what I'm living today. So over the number of years, I have taken all of the different experiences that I've had, from the abuse, the drug use, the violence, the criminal behavior, the interventions that were ineffective. And when I say interventions, I mean the separations. When I was being arrested as a juvenile, when I had child protective service engagement, when I was being arrested as an adult, when I was mandated treatment, when I had courts intervene and tell me I was an unfit parent. Those were all opportunities to provide services that could have helped me not just to stabilize my own life, but to contribute to our community in an effective way, and to reintegrate into the lives of my children and reunify our family so we could break cycles. Because 2 of my children grew up in foster care, and 1 went from foster care into a 10-year prison sentence. So those are patterns that are consistently repeated, where I thought I was doing my children a service by not dragging them through the kind of life I grew up in. I was actually allowing them to be essentially regurgitated through this very, very sick cycle of dependence. And so because of my experience, and then moving on to my education and getting this scholarship, it really compelled me to follow through on the commitments that I made while in school, because I went back to school to try to change a system, because I believe in the capabilities of every single human being on this planet. I know that I am not unique. I know that if I can overcome one, if not all of the things that I've experienced, that other people can too. In 2017, and sorry that I'm jumping around, but I think it's really necessary. But in 2017, I joined a church. I believed that I needed to do that in order to mend some things internally that I was not getting other places. And so I did that. And this church just happens to be home to many people that are very outdoorsy, for lack of a better word. And so I started hiking in probably, I want to say, 2014. And then I started backpacking. And so I met this man at my church who invited me out for a day hike. And it was actually a mountain climb. And we were supposed to be back by 1 o'clock. We left his place, him and a group of us left his place at about 5 o'clock in the morning. We got to the trailhead at 6. Turns out that this was a mountain climb, and I'm definitely terrified of heights. So we got to this ridge line, and I was pretty sure that I was going to have an anxiety attack or something. And I let him know, hey, I'm really afraid of heights. And I ended up sliding down the mountain. We were crossing this basin. It's snowy. I'm in crampons. I've never done any of this before. And then we get to the top of this mountain. They get me there. I made it. It actually happened. I thought I was going to die in the process, but it didn't happen. But one of our team members slipped, hit his crampon on a tree after we had summited, and broke his tibia. We spent the next almost 22 hours on that mountain trying to get our guy off. It was a traumatic and epic experience. I was on my feet for almost 24 hours straight on a mountain in the rain, sleet, and cold. There was one headlamp amongst 5 people. We were all soaked to the bone, but we had to get our guy off. I didn't know any of these guys. And honestly, I thought maybe if I fell that they might just let me die because I had no idea who these guys were. I didn't have a long track record with being able to trust people in my life. But it turns out that I've become extremely good friends with all of the people that I've climbed with. But when we finally got down to the trailhead, search and rescue, we were able to connect with search and rescue. We got down to the trailhead and we were in the search and rescue trailer getting warm. We were eating some food, waiting for someone to come and get us. And it dawned on me that I had no idea of what I was actually capable of. Because what I had accomplished that night on that mountain was beyond anything I ever thought physically possible for me. And that's when I lost all excuses. That I realized that I had held myself in this space, telling myself what I could and couldn't do. And it was mostly what I couldn't do, which was almost everything. And that I had bound myself to these unrealistic parameters. And that night on that mountain, it all changed for me. And that's when I knew. And that was actually before I went back to college, but that is when I knew that I could do anything I set my mind to. And that started to snowball after a period of time. So by the time I was, the Truman Scholar, I'd been named the Truman Scholar, I knew that I had to continue on in the same way that I did after I got off that mountain. I knew that I needed to follow through on that plan that I made. I knew that I had a unique experience with incarceration, welfare, homelessness, child services, and addiction and violence and all of these different things. And I needed to use that experience to actually create something for people like me to overcome. Because of my almost decade of experience working with either in volunteering or being paid to work in social services, I knew that I wasn't serving people like myself. I wasn't helping them to get to their highest place possible. I wasn't helping them to fulfill the dreams that they would sit in front of me and tell me that they had. I would hand them what I was able to hand them and say, I'm sorry, this is all I can do. Well, maybe if you do this, but I know you're going to come back to this environment, but that's all I can give you. And I know beyond anything that is not all I could do. And that's why I made the decision to go back to school. So, I after getting the Truman Scholarship, I moved away from Seattle. My daughter is sure that I destroyed her entire life because she was in high school with friends that, she was in school with. But sometimes moves are really necessary. I had done a couple of shows with Eric Johnson on Como 4, and I posted a couple of pictures. Because I got my graduation photo taken, and there was a mugshot of me where I literally looked like I walked out of a concentration camp. And I put the 2 photos together, my graduation photos and the other photo, and I posted it. And within 3 days, it went viral all over the world. I was doing another show with Eric Johnson at the time. He did an Eric's Heroes series and or episode of me, and my story just completely blew up. And I ended up moving to San Diego as a result of that. But today. And that compelled me to actually create what I've created today. I went down to San Diego and I learned about another program that was great. And I got in contact with a Tennessee politician who ran the Department of Human Services under 2 administrations and wanted my help to create an initiative. And so today I'm an executive consultant with the state of Tennessee. I work with the Department of Human Services, and we're creating an initiative to create a framework to support overcoming as opposed to program dependence. We have a lot of programs in our nation right now that function through the funding that is supported by capacity. And what I mean by that is that if we're not full of people that need help, then we're not going to get the funding that's necessary to pay our paychecks. And that's what I experienced working with a few nonprofits. And so I went down to San Diego and I learned about this program, and and I learned about what they didn't have that I wanted to create. And I started working with Tennessee, and I moved back to Washington because I was compelled to create my own program, one that I believe was necessary. And so that's what I've done. I just published a book the other day. The proceeds are going to help fund a community-based program. This program that I've created is called OUT, O-UT, Overhaul Through Unrelenting Transfiguration. Overhaul is to completely change something. You take your car in to have it overhauled, and you get all of the things fixed on it that don't work anymore. And unrelenting means not giving up. It means just being just obsessive about it. And transfiguration is a metamorphosis. And so, OUT really stands for the hard work that it takes to change your own life. And that's what this program that I've created is. It started out as a curriculum with the process that I implemented in my own life while I was sitting in jail, and that what has carried me through over these last 10 years. And I believe that that's what experience does, is it gives us an opportunity to create teachable processes for others that can't find their way out of situations. And so what I've done is I've created a way out. And it's not just a way out for people in incarceration and addiction. However, that is my target audience with this program. And, with the program, it will be facilitated with people with lived experience. I think there's something really dynamic that creates hope and belief in ways that other things don't. When you have a person that has been incarcerated and they come in to speak to people that are incarcerated, and they share opportunities because they've had that same experience, I think that instills hope and belief in people that otherwise wouldn't have known existed. But this program, will come in, will facilitate this process. It's a 10-module process. And then we will have a structured housing program on the back end of that. And what that structured housing program does is it walks people through how to learn how to navigate society successfully, because I know that I never learned how to do that. I learned how to hustle at a really young age. And even though some of those skills and qualities support what it is that I'm doing today, I didn't have the fundamentals necessary to know how to navigate life in society in a way that helped me to actually be successful and not end up in incarceration. Because that's what happened for me multiple times. My problem-solving skills get me locked up. My problem-solving skills have gotten me loaded. And so I had to figure out how to change those things. And so I've created something that helps other people to do that. Currently, I'm in negotiation with the Department of Corrections in Washington State, with Pierce County. I'm working with some folks in Thurston County. We'll see how it all works out. But I don't want to sit around and wait for them to sign the check or sign the contract. So I'm trying to raise funds for my own community-based facility, and then we'll see what happens next. I'm in the middle of writing a book. I've been clean and sober 10 years, 1 month, and I don't know how many days. I definitely have contact with my kids. They're all pretty mad at me right now, but that's part of parenting, I think. But what I'm not doing is I'm not raising a bunch of kids that are going in and out of prison. My son is doing exceptionally well after his release. He's been out for a couple years. My 16-year-old is perpetually mad at me, but I think that has a lot to do with hormones and being 16 and me not doing everything she wants, but yeah, so, that's just kind of everything in a nutshell. I just want to say we're not serving people at our highest capacity. We're not asking the right people to come in and participate. We're supporting the further destruction of human life. We're writing policy based on somebody's perspective and not somebody's experience. We're not inviting the right people into the conversations. We're dancing with these narratives and these ideologies, and we're spending trillions of dollars to do it. And our population is deteriorating. We see it all over the streets. As the population in our carceral facilities decrease, our population on our streets increase. We've seen that happen over the years with our mental hospitals. Now we're seeing it with our prison population, and we have to be more intentional. We have to be more intentional. If you wouldn't do it to your child, you shouldn't be doing it to other people. We have to teach people how to be accountable. We have to teach people how to care for themselves. We have to help to reunify families. And we're not doing any of that today, but we do have the capabilities to do that. And I really hope that you join me in that fight.